Today's session, which is understanding the agronomy of intercrops, is to try and break down some of the barriers that we are aware of about whether or not we should be growing intercrops and how it happens. We specifically have today, as I said, Richard was hopefully going to be speaking, but if he may not get here in time, three of the questions that are often being asked of us are: what species should we do? What seed rate should we be using? And also, what about fertilizer? So we're picking up on those three questions today, and I appreciate I haven't got everybody's proper titles here. We've got Ali Kali from the Hutton Institute, Aaron Mucklot from PGRO, and also Amelda Uwezi from Reading University, speaking on those areas. And really, to start off with, want to do an introduction and an overview of what LEGUMINOSE is. And LEGUMINOSE is a European funded project sponsored by the European Union under Horizon Europe project, and it's also part funded in the UK from UKRI, in that UK project. So we are funded by the British government as part of this wider European project. There's two parts to this project. The first one is research field trials being run by universities and research organisations. So in the UK, our partners are Reading University. We've also got research projects in Denmark, in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Italy, and also in Spain. Of more relevant, perhaps to a lot of people here, is that we also have online labs in 9 countries. So the 6 we've mentioned, as well as addition, we actually also have, so we have Italy, Spain, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, UK, Egypt, and Pakistan. So we have a wide range of work being done here. And in each country, the intention is to have 20 field trials. So there's 180 different ones across the whole of the European region of these trials. And by combining the research and the information, what we're hoping to do is create knowledge spread from farmers to the education systems, farmers to researchers, because researchers need to know what farmers want to know, and to extension and advisory staff, so that there is therefore the way that we can educate and move on the knowledge. The way we're running things in the project for these 20 field labs, if anyone is interested, we're literally having sort of small tramline or plot drops combined with plots of a legumine cereal, and the legumes. So we have the 2 monocrops together and the intercrop together, which means that we are getting comparisons between yield, crop quality, and soil right next to each other, which is much more useful than a lot of the anecdotal work, which has been based around different fields. We've run this project for 2 years now. We're coming into our 3rd year of trials, and just to highlight one of the results from one of these projects in 2024, this last year, this is on the Cotswolds. So a farmer was trying oats and beans for the first time on his own farm, and his results, very dry for him, and also we had issues with harvest. So as you can see, the benefit of the intercrop, we actually get a higher total yield per field than we would by doing the 2 monocrops together. Economically, there was an increased value by doing the same. So we're actually earning more money off the field from this multifaceted way of farming. So it seems to make some sense from an agricultural point of view. And we know we get these other benefits of intercropping. So we get this greater on-farm diversity. We get more resilient crop systems. So you can see that from where we had slightly non-ideal crop yields, but actually 2 poorish crops ended up with 1 moderate crop from the field. So it was quite worth doing. So we've got the potential higher yield field yields, and also potentially higher quality, because anecdotally we know we're getting higher quality in the wheat, for example, in an intercrop. And as a result, we are becoming less reliant on nitrogen fertilizers and also with agrochemicals. But what we also have, as a consequence of a meeting we held 18 months ago through a workshop, is some of the challenges and barriers we've got in cropping. So we have agronomy in the field. We have a lack of knowledge about mixes and varieties. We have a potential problem with mixed products, cross-contamination, marketing, what we can do with what we're growing. And so this is part of the areas we're looking at within the project. And specifically, today we want to look at agronomy in the field and try and break down one of those barriers about the lack of knowledge and mixes of varieties and seed rates. That's one of the problems we've had developed through this. And so that's what Leguminose is about. Also, very highlighting for those who haven't noticed, we have a new funding scheme in England. So CIPM3, companion crop on arable and horticulture land, pays an additional £55 a hectare. Probably not enough, but its purpose of this is to do one of the following, or one or more. Support an integrated pest management approach so we can minimize the need to have pesticide use, provide a habitats for birds and invertebrates, particularly and including pollinators and natural crop pest predators. So the food sources for them is there, they are quicker, they're likely to be there before an infestation issue happens. There's a way of managing the nutrient efficiency. So if we can produce more crops with less inputs, it's better for the environment and the economics of the farm in question. And it also helps protect the soil and improve its condition. So the government agrees with intercropping has a basis. And just to remind everybody of the rules of the game, as it were, you must establish a companion crop on land entered in this action during the year, and it has to be growing with the main arable or horticultural crop. Now, although the companion crop does not have to be present for the whole growing period, as long as it's managed in a way to be reasonably expected to achieve the aims, which is that's what's at the top, we're okay. But to my mind, if we're going to be growing a second crop together, we really want to be looking at ways of maximizing the return from both. Granted that things like living mulches, Berseem clover growing in amongst oilseed rape is obviously a way of reducing some of the potential risks of flea beetle and the like. So this is the basis on which we've been working within this project and the questions that we're leading to moving forward. That was all I was going to say. Richard, unfortunately, doesn't look like he's managed to get here. So if he gets here before the end of the session, we will bring him in. But I want to hand over now to our speakers just to start building that picture that we're looking to do. So I'm going to hand over to Ali to explain her work that she's been doing and some of the other projects that this is a follow-up from. And so it's very much a question of let's move from previous work and make it better, rather than just trying to reinvent the wheel. So Ali, over to you.
Thank you. Just bear with me, I just need to put on full screen. Okay, can you slide in presentation mode? Brilliant. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you, Jerry, very much for your invitation to speak today. My name's Alison Carley, and I'm an agroecologist in the Ecological Sciences Department at the James Hutton Institute, which is just based outside on the outskirts of Dundee. As I think we've seen some of the people joining the call, and intercropping is definitely not a novel or new concept to a number of the people I've met over the years through intercropping work. But just to sort of give a bit of an overview, we know that the list of terms that is used to describe this practice of growing two or more crop species together can be as diverse almost as the cropping practice itself. And it's not a new practice. It's been established for centuries in traditional farming systems across the world. But it's not common in modern farming systems, as Jerry's already alluded to, and there are challenges to overcome if it's to become widely accepted. The reasons why people might consider intercropping, again, Jerry has covered some of the key points, but over the years that we've been working on intercrops, we've either generated our own data or become familiar with other people's data to understand some of the motivations for why intercropping might be of interest. And it's because this increase in the crop diversity in this way can lead to its own biodiversity benefits, so providing more resources to other organisms in the system, whether above or below ground. There also can be benefits for productivity, as Jerry's also just shown in the oat bean trial, that there is greater productivity or yield per unit area of land, which can also arise from lead to more efficient nutrient use or reductions in crop protection requirements for pest control. And there's also increasing evidence that this cropping approach, diversifying the crop in this way, can lead to more resilience to the climate or meteorological fluctuations that we're experiencing more regularly under climate change. And some studies have shown that in some circumstances with some crop mixtures, that intercrops can lead to greater sequestration of carbon in the soil. So what I want to do is give you a very quick overview of some of the research we've been doing over the past multiple years, actually quite a few years, in various projects, looking at how what are some of the outcomes from intercropping, but also what are some of the practical considerations for growing intercrops. And I will talk about species combinations, but I'll also talk about other aspects of intercrop agronomy, just because it's all packaged together, it's all related. But before I do that, I just want to give a bit of an overview about the different ways that people might sow intercrops. And much of our work is with cereal legume intercrops. We have done some work with oilseeds and a bit of work with cover crop forage mixtures, but much of it is cereal legumes. So I'm going to take cereals and legumes as an example. So shown in this graphic here, we've got two different crops called crop 1 and crop 2. Let's say crop 1 is a cereal crop, the green one, and it's grown at quite a high seeding rate. Crop 2, well, I'm going to say that's a legume crop. It's growing at a much lower seeding rate because the plants are bigger when they grow. When we grow intercrops, with these different crop components as a mixture, there are different ways we can do that. We can do it by, and generally what would happen is that at least one of the crops is sown at a lower seeding rate in the mixture than it would be as in monoculture. So we could be growing a 50-50 mixture. So that's where both the cereal and the legume are grown at half the sowing rate of those crops in monoculture, and that's called a replacement design. So you're taking out some of one crop and replacing it with another crop. But you can have these additive designs, and there are different, sorry, I should say those replacement designs, we don't have to be 50-50, they could be 60-40, 70-30, and so on. But you can also have additive designs, and that's where one of the crops is kept at its standard monoculture seeding rate, or and the other crop is reduced in sowing density, or each crop can be reduced by a small amount, but not to the extent that we've got a replacement design. So I've given sort of two extremes of that spectrum: 150 mix, where the cereal crop is grown at 100% of its monoculture sowing rate, but the legume is at 50% of its sowing rate, and the opposite scenario where you've got the cereal at 50% of its sowing rate and the legume at 100%. And that's just to give you a few examples, because you'll come across these types different terminologies if you expose yourself to lots of different intercropping types of trials. And the reason that it's useful to know about this is that one of the ways that we can measure intercrop performance is by comparing the observed yield, the yield that we get from our intercropping trials, with the yield that we would expect from those crops. And the way we calculate this expected yield, we call it, is by looking at that sowing ratio and multiplying that by the yield in monoculture. So basically what we're saying is that we've got this yield. Let's take the cereal. We get a certain amount of yield from that cereal when it's grown in monoculture, but when we're growing it at, say, a 50-50 mix, we would expect that cereal crop to produce half the yield that it would if it was grown at the higher seeding rate in monoculture. And that's our expected yield. We can then compare that expected yield to the observed yield, the yield that we actually get. And if it's higher than the expected yield, then this is what we term as over-yielding. And that's what Jerry showed in his example earlier. You're getting more yield than you would expect from the monoculture. Of course, if it's the same, then the intercrops have not done any, have performed similarly in the intercrop and in the monoculture. And if it's less, then they've done less well in the intercrop. We coordinated an EU project called Diversify, which ran from 2017 to 2021, and it involved partners across Europe, similar in the way that the LEGUMINOSE project does now. Over 2 years of that 4-year project, we carried out coordinated intercrop trials of cereals and legumes, of barley and pea, and of wheat and faba bean. And those trials were carried out at research farm sites across Europe. We had overlap in the varieties that were grown, and we tried to make sure that the sowing condition, the growing agronomy of those trials was fairly comparable. And what we did a whole variety of measurements in those trials, but one of the key things that we found was when we looked at the observed yield these mixtures, whether we looked at the barley and pea in the individual trials in each country or the average across those trials, the observed yield was higher than the expected yield, calculated from the yields of the crops when they were grown in the monocultures. And this was true for barley and pea. It was also true for wheat and faba bean. So this overyield phenomenon is quite consistently seen in intercrop trials, not only in our trials, but in trials that have been conducted across the world. And it obviously has potential benefits for productivity, for profitability, allowing greater production per unit area of land, especially as the intercrop requires fewer fertilizer and crop protection inputs. Those same trials that I've just shown you, we actually carried them out under two different management conditions. What we called a high input management, that was where the wheat and faba bean or the barley and pea crops were grown at the standard standard input conditions for the cereal component of the intercrop. And we also grew them under what we call low input conditions, where we grew them at, well, less than half of the standard input, but generally between 25% and 0% of the standard inputs for the cereal. And when we look at how those two different crop combinations responded to those two different management conditions, and in the 2 years of the study, we can see that there is quite a lot of variability. Now, I'm using a different metric of performance here. It's called the land equivalent ratio, and I won't go into detail of how that's calculated. I have a feeling somebody after me might be telling me that. The key thing to pick out here is that any value greater than 1, where this dotted line is, means that the intercrop is performing better than the crops in monoculture. And you can see that for wheat and faba bean, in both years of study and under low and high input conditions, we've got values greater than 1. So the intercrop is always performing better than the monocultures. But there's variability in how it responds. So in 2017, the wheat and faba bean intercrops do better under low input conditions compared with high input conditions, whereas in 2018, they perform pretty similarly. Barley and pea, on the other hand, shows a slightly different pattern. So again, in any values above the line of 0, the 1.0 line shows that the performance is better in intercrops, and this is what we see in 2017. Not a huge difference between low and high input, but in 2018 the intercrops didn't perform any better than the monocultures. And this variability of the responses of intercrops to contextual conditions is quite a challenge for us, where we're carrying out these research farm trials, which are generally small plot trials, as shown in the top left corner here. But we want to be able to translate our findings to larger scale conditions, field scale trials, and to all the different pedoclimatic conditions that are experienced by farmers across Scotland, in our case, across the whole of the UK or Europe within an EU project. So one of the ways that we've taken to try and address this is to work with farmers in those environmental conditions to trial intercrops and to look at how the intercrops respond to the varying pedoclimatic conditions. We started this initiative in the Diversify project, but we consolidated it in a more recent project, which was funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, called the SEAMS project. And this project ran over 3 years, where we grew mainly spring cereal legume mixtures, but we also had some oilseeds and cover crop mixtures in those trials. And we grew them with farmers across north, eastern and central Scotland, and even some in the southwest of Scotland. And we measured yield, of course, but we also looked at other crop system responses in those trials. There were a total of 43 trials altogether run over a 3-year period in this project. And sorry, I'm going to expose you to yet another metric of intercrop performance. One we use, it's called the crop performance ratio, and we use it when we don't have the individual yields of the crops components in the mixture, which is quite often the case in these on-farm trials. So the crop performance ratio is the ratio of the intercrop yield to the some of the monoculture yields. And overall, across these 43 trials, we had a crop performance ratio of 1.19. So any value greater than 1 shows that there's a yield advantage with mixtures compared with the monocultures. So that average crop performance ratio of 1.19 means that on average, we had about 19% greater yield with mixtures compared with monocultures. When we break it down to look at the different combinations of crops that we had in there, we saw that increasing the number of crop components to 3 had a greater benefit for the crop performance ratio than 2 crop intercrops. But also we can drill down a little bit more into the crops, the species within those cereal legume mixtures. And when we look at the crop performance ratio of the legumes, we can see that both beans and peas, and in some trials we have both, all give crop performance ratio values greater than 1. But for the cereals, not all cereals respond positively to intercropping in terms of their crop performance ratio. So oats and wheat they give values of greater than 1, but barley sits around 1. Rye, we only had 1 trial site with a couple of reps, so it's far too, the error bars are too big to draw any conclusions. We also looked at some of the agronomic inputs and conditions that these trials were under. So we found that ploughing and use of herbicide had small positive effects on crop performance ratio. And when we looked at the level of fertilizer inputs or the type of fertilizer, whether it was organic matter or synthetic fertilizer, or when we compared conventional to organic management, we didn't see any clear effects on crop performance ratio. We also, because this project was carried out over 3 years, where we had quite diverse meteorological conditions or climatic conditions in over that period, we could look at some of the larger scale drivers of intercrop performance. And what this analysis showed is that we saw increase in crop performance ratio with higher temperatures and with lower rainfall. So the intercropping gave better outcomes compared with monocultures when conditions were warmer and drier. And over the 3 years of our study, if you just look at the crop performance ratio across all the trials carried out in each of those 3 years, we can see that there's the highest crop performance ratios, those values above 1, were obtained in 2021 and 2022, which were much warmer, drier years for us than 2020. So it seems that this sort of confirms the general concept that increasing the diversity of the crop is quite a good bet hedging approach under harsh growing conditions, that when you have 2 or more crop components in a field, there's a good chance at least one of them is going to grow well enough to produce a yield. I've just thrown this in for a bit of interest because it's not about agronomy, but I thought you might be interested to see these data, which were collected from in 2022 from the trials that were carried out in the projects I've been describing to you. We had a master's student who visited most of the trial sites to do bird counts. She was interested in understanding whether intercropping promoted bird species richness. And what she found was from her farmland bird counts that there wasn't a significant difference in the species richness of birds between mixtures and monocultures, but there was a significantly higher frequency of visits of the mixtures by birds compared with the monoculture plots. And these field trials had mixtures and monoculture plots in the same field. So this gives support to the concept or the hypothesis that by increasing the diversity of crop, that we increase the diversity of other resources to other organisms in the crop. And this may relate to the fact that we tend to see lower abundance of pests, insects in the crop in mixtures compared with monocultures. All the data from the trials that we carried out in this SEAMS project are available in a database that's openly accessible online at this URL at the top here. If you go to the website, there's a little button you can click here that gives you a bit of a guided tour around the web page, but it's a fairly flat website. It's not many pages nested one inside the other. You can just go to the front page, and then there are various parts of it below this top welcome banner. It's basically a big table, a big database of crop trials, and each of those trials, it tells you what crops were in the trial, what the management was, what the agronomy was, where we have any observations. It'll give you the crop performance ratio, and then when we have any other observations from the trials. You can also visualize the data on a map, so you can see where the trials were carried out and see there's a color coding to explain which trials showed the highest crop performance ratios and which the lowest. If you click on, I should have said you can filter this table, so it's multiple pages in this data set, but you can filter it depending on the crop species that you're interested in. So if you want to see any trials with, I don't know, let's say peas in it, then you can deselect everything and then just select peas, and that will bring you up a list of all the trials with peas in them. Or if you want to be more specific and look at, say, trials with beans and wheat, you can just select those two and just get the wheat bean trials. And if you do that and you want to click on any one of these rows to look at in more detail at that trial, it'll bring up a page with all the details of that trial. This is only the part of that page. I couldn't fit it all on one screen, but this is for our own trial near the James Hutton Institute. It'll tell you what the crop was grown for, what inputs it had, what the sowing density was, which crop species, which varieties of crop species, what the sowing rates were, when it was sown, when it was harvested, what inputs, what soil cultivation, etc., etc. There's quite a lot of detail, more than shown in this screen. So if you're interested, please do head over to that website and have a look, because it will potentially give you some information about the agronomy of intercrops that might be relevant to your growing conditions. And just to round off, I wanted to give you a heads up about another data set, almost as extensive as the one I've just shown you, on winter pea barley intercropping. Now, winter peas aren't typically grown in this part of northern UK, mainly because they tend to be quite susceptible to canopy collapse. But as you know, growing a pea with a cereal can provide a scaffolding for the pea and overcome that canopy collapse issue. But for us, there's what we realise is there's very little known about the agronomy of winter pea barley crops, and which cultivars to grow, what mixing proportions work best, what sowing densities, how they respond to different management practices. So we set out in this 3-year project, which was funded by the Mains of Loyston Charitable Foundation, to try and answer some of those questions. We carried out a series of trials over 3 years, mostly at our farm site, but also at some local friendly farmer sites, to gather data in relation to these questions. I'm just going to give you a very high-level summary of the findings, because we're in the process of collating the data for a sort of mega analysis across all of the trials. But what we found from our first look-see is that generally these mixtures perform less well in direct drill conditions compared with plough conditions. We see the highest grain yields if we look at a range of different of nitrogen input levels, we see the highest grain yields at around 75% of the standard nitrogen input level for winter barley, and 125% of standard sowing density. So you remember at the beginning I talked about replacement and additive design. So we find an additive design with a total of around 125% of a monoculture sowing rate works best for these for winter pea barley mixtures. We found that grain yields tended to be highest in the equal ratio 50-50 barley pea mixtures, or mixtures with a higher proportion of barley but not with a higher proportion of pea, and this related to lower levels of weed cover under these conditions. So I just want to finish off by mentioning, as Jerry alluded to, we are involved in another project called the Legumes project, where we're carrying on some of this on-farm trial work with farmers. This is an EU project funded by Horizon Europe, but also in the UK by UKRI. And we have partners across Europe involved. The focus of this project is understanding and quantifying the ecosystem services from legume crops. And the project is covering a whole range of different types of legumes, from grain legumes to forage legumes and cover crops. It includes some wild and woody legume species. And of course, it includes cereal legume mixtures. Why wouldn't it? We have what we're calling pilot studies. These are mainly research farm focused trials in the countries indicated here, but also we're carrying out these participatory or on-farm trials, when we should have a total of 42 by the end of the project. There are a whole range of other activities and things that we're working on as part of this project. But if you're interested, please do go over to this the project website, and maybe you could sign up to the newsletter to get updates on the activities of the project. So I want to finish there. I hope it's not been too fast a run through of quite a large volume of data and findings, and hopefully some pointers to where you can find out a bit more information. Particularly want to thank you all for listening. And it's actually impossible to thank everybody who's been involved, because these large multi-partner projects are quite difficult to collate everybody's names and organisations onto one slide. But they're just finished by saying thank you, particularly to the farmers who have been involved in our trials, but also to all the partners and stakeholders and knowledge transfer organisations we've worked with to help us spread the message, including Soil Association today, and colleagues, of course, who've collaborated with us or supported our work, and of course, and last but not least, the funders. And thank you all for listening.
Great, thank you, Ali. That was an excellent quick run through to what is quite a complicated set of trials, so that's great. It's a couple of questions just for you directly. One of the questions was the ratio of winter barley and peas at 50-50, actual 50-50, or 50-50 of standard seed rate, if that makes sense?
So it's 50-50 of standard seed rate. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Rapid one.
There was a question about, you said herbicides back at the bin when you were talking about crop performance ratio. You mentioned herbicides. In that respect, you meant pre-emergence herbicides, or was that spot treatment or a broad spectrum application?
Probably a bit of everything. Because there is such a diversity of different, we didn't try and say to the farmers who participate in these trials, do it this way, do it that way. You know, we didn't dictate what herbicide or any other inputs. So it's very much what their standard practice. And so that was quite, the only sensible way we could factor that into an analysis was herbicide used or was it not? And so, yeah, we can't really say whether it's pre-emergence or during crop growth, I'm afraid. But that data set should have all that information. So if for instance, you're interested in, let's say, pea barley, you could go in and filter out and just find those trials and find out exactly what was used.
Right, that's brilliant. The rest of them, I think there is a question that's popped up a couple of times about harvesting these crops together or separate, and it is one of those issues that comes down to later on. And what we're finding is generally these crops are harvested together and then either separated for different marketplaces, or in the case of it's grown for animal food, can go directly to a mill in that form, will be used in that form. There are some complications in that. So just perhaps to clarify, that's the way that we will treat these crops in these trials. And also to pick up on what Ali said, same as for leguminose, we are dependent on the farmer to do it, and often we just leave the farmer to grow the crops their way, and when we work out what happens with the results after that. So the farmer is in control of all of these trials. It's not a managed trial in the way that some are. Okay, thank you. Yeah, on that, what about the quality and maturation timing of the crops? That's something that generally we try to pick a species of varieties that will come up together, but we do know that there is a little bit of a joining up. So a later variety one will often come forward a little bit, or an early one will be delayed slightly to come harvesting together. But picking the species is important to make that happen, isn't it?
Yeah, so yes, picking species that work well together. So barley and pea we find work well together, but also you can pick. There is at least in the UK, the recommended lists will tell you a bit about maturity timings, and so you can try and pick varieties that are going to mature early or late if that's what you want. There is an element from our experience, we haven't tried to quantify this, but anecdotally, that when you grow things together, there tends to be a bit of coming together of the maturity timings, but that doesn't always work. It's not reliable.
No.
So choosing the species that are more likely to have similar maturity timings and then varieties within those species is how we go about it.
Yeah, excellent.
I noticed there was a question.
That's a really...
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I saw there was a question on separation or whether it's use of feed. So a bit of a mixture. Sorry for the pun. Some people have their own access to their own grain separation facilities. So some of the farmers are separated and put the crops down their different separate processing or selling routes. Others would be using it as a mixture for feed, but also for other things. One of our farmers was putting it into an anaerobic digestion plant, for example.
Okay, can we moving on? Keep moving on. Actually, there's a perfect segue in terms of getting these varieties and times. Let's hand on over to Erin from the PGRO, the PGRO, the Pulse Growers Research Organisation, are the organisation you go to look at maturity classes of pulses and do the research. So delighted to hand over to Erin to just talk through some of the work that they've been doing on intercropping and sort of related work. So Erin, thank you very much.
Are we good with that? Hey, so
yes,
thanks,
we're good.
Jerry. As mentioned, I am with PGRO as the research agronomist. So our view kind of fits into with a lot of what's been spoken on already, but we tend to focus more on the pulse component and let's try and supplement the pea or bean with a cereal versus what some other research around the globe has put in a pea or bean to supplement this cereal. So just keep that in mind a little bit as I go through our seeding rates and our intentions moving forward. So as Ali mentioned, she gave an LER component there. So just to define that is you're looking at the intercrop yield of crop A over top of your monocrop of that same crop and adding that to your division of your intercrop yield of crop B over the pure crop of yield B. So it is bringing in yield, and we find this more of an important thing to look at versus just straight yield, as it is indicating that land use efficiency. So if your LER is greater than 1, it is suggesting that those crops are advantageously growing together. And so if you have a 1.2, you're getting 20% more yield of those two crops growing together versus a monocrop. Or another way to look at it is to get that same yield, you would need to require 20% more land. So just keep that in mind. A lot of what I'm sharing is looking at an LER versus true yield, as it just kind of remove some of that variability year on year. So we did start working on intercropping pre-2018, but in 2018 is when we really started to put things in motion a little bit. And at that point, our concentration was more on peas. So looking at different scenarios, so peas at 70 plants per square meter, so that's your standard rate, and then supplementing in with the same rate of oats and going all the way down to 18 for your spring oats. Or looking at, instead of spring oats, put in spring beans. So in 2018, everything was looking fairly positive on all mixes we looked at. So that gave us some indication, let's move forward to give it another year. So in 2019, had the same rates as we did in 2018, but now we've also thrown in some spring beans and spring oats. So your full rate of spring beans, and then you're titrating down from 50 on your spring oats to 13. Looking at the LER on that, that was not very conducive or looking great for a spring bean and spring oat, but it was all right. You can also tell that P at 70 and spring oats at 18, so that middle section there wasn't as good as it was in 2018, but the other two mixes were better. So then in 2020, so we're kind of figuring we've have our P thing under control. Let's focus a little bit more on spring beans and spring oats. So we really bumped it up. So in our spring beans, we had our full rate at 50, and then we also have that rate to 25. And then our spring oats really bumped it up. So full rate of spring oats and all the way down to a third of the rate. So try to find any different kind of combination to maybe have a spring bean and spring oat look a little bit more positive than it did in 2019. And it was pretty clear that we needed that full rate of spring beans to really make it viable under the LER component there. And our peas and spring beans continue to look positive all the way throughout those 3 years. And as you can tell, if you really want to look at this really deep in, you can tell that some mixes in some years looked good and it did not in others. So this does come down to environmental conditions, and I'll get more into that as we move forward here. So taking this all on, we've pretty much established that we needed to have our full rate of the legume and then titrate a little bit more on our spring oats. We kind of chose the spring oats more for a weed and pest management side with that allelopathic was really where we went with that spring oat component compared to another cereal. So looking at spring beans and oats, moving forward from 2020. So we looked at this in 2021, 22, and 23. Now this is looking at yield just to put things into perspective a little bit more. So 21 was a great year for beans. And then we started to have a nice, lovely decline. 24, we were back up. I don't have that data on here. And 2022 was the good year for oats, and the other 2 years were not. You can kind of see that across our different rates. So full rate of spring beans on it all, and then an increasing rate of our oats here. So going at 30, 50, and 70. So when oats were good, our total yield was up there quite a bit. So quick look at this, it's looking, yeah, okay, you guys did something right in the first year. After that, not so much. Maybe these two crops should not be as an intercrop, or the rates are really off and you got to hit the reset. But if we were to look at it in terms of an LER component, looking a little bit more of a clearer picture, a lot nicer, more consistent year on year, other than in 2022. So with it being that dry in 22, there's a high possibility that the beans are just not able to do what they needed to do, and the oats became more of a weed versus an advantageous thing. So it just robbed the yield as a whole, especially when we started increasing it up to that 70. So I would say keep in mind, looking at the conditions, if it looks to be another droughty year, keep the beans at the 50 and maybe just throttle back a little bit on the oat component. But if it looks like the years that we've had, like last year, then it definitely increasing that oat to that 70 point is going to be all right. I don't have the 24 data in this simply because I can't release that yet. Now, the other components we looked at was spring peas and oats. Here again, kept our peas like we saw in our early work, keep them at our standard rate of 70, and then look at different oat combinations. So your 30, your 50, and your 70. So same oat yield, because this is in the exact same trial as before, except now we have peas. So peas looked good in 21 and 22, not so great in 23. But if you compare the intercropping yields compared to the monocrop, the peas were staying the same. It's just adding that oat seemed to build everything above it. So a lot of synergy here between the peas and the oats. Suspect is that the oats were able to keep those peas upright. So you're not getting near the lodging if you had some potential sparse plant populations compared to a monocrop. So similar here, doesn't look great in some years, especially in 2023. But if I flip to the LER side of things, we're looking very consistent year on year. Everything's looking above 1. And here, even on the drier years, increasing that oat population to 70 versus 30 is not really as bad as it was with the beans. So just knowing your crop species and what is required is definitely something to be looking at. Now moving on to spring pea and beans, what's really intriguing for us on this one is in terms of overall rotational pest and disease management. So until we fully understand potential increased legumes in our rotations through intercropping and that, we're considering every time you have a pea or bean in that field as your 1 in 5. So even if it's an intercrop or a companion crop, we want to consider that as your legume crop. So putting both legumes in the field at once only makes sense. Your peas are going to be climbing those bean stems and also help mitigate some bean rust coming into those bean plants. So we looked at pretty much a total combination of 120 plants. There's a lot more work done behind this. There actually was an article in our Pulse magazine a few years ago that dug into this a little bit more. But these two are really the ones that we kept moving forward with. So peas at 70, spring beans at 50, did okay. But then we have that peas at 100 and spring beans at 20. It was just a little bit better year over year, even looking at the yield. And then when I put up the LER, that's really, really showing consistency and doing a whole lot better than that peas at 70 and beans at 50. So definitely something to be looking at. In terms of picking varieties here, just look at their recommended list and you want to grab an early maturing bean to go with your late maturing pea, and they'll be coming in at relatively the same time frame. So we're bringing in our maturities together with that combination. And we do have farms doing this at a field scale, and that is for their own internal livestock use. So up until this point, I've been going year by year by year. So if I want to bring the last 4 years, and this does include our 2024 data in here, it's really looking positive on all combinations, in all seed rates and all the rest here. So in spring beans, a higher oats does make sense, but I would say still be cautious of the weather conditions. And if we are seeing a repeat of 2022 at some point, you might want to just lower back that oat rate. And in peas, increasing the oat is increasing our LER on top of that more and more all the time, simply because I would say the peas are able to not lodge as easily. Then our peas and beans, this is really surprising as to how well this is doing. And your peas at 100 and beans at 20 is performing that much better. I will say I have not thrown economics on top of this, so maybe some of these mixes, even though they are doing a better LER for total yield, they may not pencil out in terms of economics. And that's to come down to whether you have to separate it, how hard it is to separate it, and also if you're buying seed or doing home saved seed. So there's a few different economic components to be looking at as well. Now it's really looking at the spring cropping. We have dabbled into winter cropping. Now the reason I say dabble in is to find the right crops that make sense. Because if we want to go in terms of what the RB209 and everything else is saying, you should not be putting nitrogen on this intercrop. We won't discuss what is actually happening in the field in that gray area. So by putting in a winter wheat and a winter bean, we're finding a lot of chlorosis and just sick looking wheat plants out there because the nodules on the beans are not kicking in time for that winter wheat need in the spring, pretty much at this time of year. So we're not putting this away. We'll continue to look at it. We're gonna hopefully this year, it is in the field. Instead of looking at winter wheat, we're looking at other crops such as triticale or maybe even some more of your heritage varieties in terms of wheat, just to see if there is something there without adding nitrogen if we want to be really following that RB209. So stay tuned on the winters and our winter work. But overall, we're fairly confident with the rates we have for our spring crops. We've still got some in the field going this year just to confirm what we've been seeing and keep on top of our data. More focused moving forward on our diseases and pests management. And winter intercropping, like I said, it's harder to do because of that cereal nitrogen requirement is not coinciding with our strong nodulations that the beans can be doing. And as mentioned, we are considering an intercrop that contains peas and beans as your 1 and 5 year for that legume crop. Until we know otherwise, we are doing a lot of work out in the field with soil testing just to firm up our decision, or not that decision, but just to verify what we think could be going on in the field. And just as a lovely plug, if you have the old Pgro Crop Monitor app, I would recommend removing it and installing with the new one. Our new one has every single pest, disease, and nutrient deficiency on all of our legume crops, including lupins and lentils. And if there is something you cannot find in that app, by all means, create a report, send it to us, and we'll get back to you as soon as you can. And that will be my contact information if you need to get a hold of me for anything else.
Brilliant. Thank you, Erin. Whilst you're there, there's a couple of questions. Peas, beans, and oats as a joint, as a three, what ratios would you try, or what would your advice be?
We tried that only once, and then COVID got into the way. I honestly don't. So we did peas at 70, spring oats at 125, and spring beans at 50, and the LER ran at 1.3. That's only 1 year in 2020.
Right. Okay. So
that would be a starting point based on our 1 year's of data. If somebody wants to try it.
Yeah. Well, I know somebody does.
Okay.
And then, okay, it's a broader question. When winter beans, do you struggle with the chocolate spot? Is that something that as a factor that you've had, or is that just you're aware of chocolate spot bean?
Be aware of. In terms of the intercrop, we're not finding it any worse or any better versus the monocrop. We're finding more beneficials on the rust, but chocolate spot not so much yet. But the fungicides that you can apply to chocolate spot are also allowed on your cereals, so you do have disease management options there if need be in a conventional system.
So for the non-organic farmers who are listening to that, yes. Yeah. And as far as latitude, do winter beans survive? Bearing in mind that where you come from, what is the
winter beans will survive all the way up into Scotland. So not involved in intercropping here, but we do have farmers doing field scale varietal trials of winter beans up in Scotland, as high north as Inverness. So they will grow, they will survive.
Great. Okay, and then another question. This is called drilling depth on the intercrops. Are you drilling the different crops at different depths or the same depth? Are you drilling at the same time? I suppose in the spring would be at the same time. Well, would it be at the same time?
Yeah, they were getting drilled at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Winter, we've some evidence that if you try and drill winter intercrops at the same depth, the rooks do love the beans, and then they take a fancy for the wheat as well. So
yeah, so just put them in a little. In our winter stuff, we drill at the bean depth.
Yeah, right. That's worth actually a useful piece of information. Great, thank you, Erin. Brilliant. Moving on to look at the question of fertilizer rates. As I said at the beginning, part of this LEGUMINOSE project does involve two sets of research, one of which has been done at Reading, and they are looking at the effect of nitrogen fertilization. And so I'm going to hand over to Imelda, who is running that research, to give us the first year's preliminary results and some interesting thoughts. So Imelda, over to you. She seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to share. Hello. Hi. I'm trying to share. Can you see my slide?
Yes. Yeah, just put it up as that's it. Yep.
Nice. Yep. Okay. Yeah, nice one. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Jerry. Yes, I'm Imelda, and I work with John Hammond and Tom Sisma at the University of Reading. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Oh, yep. Brilliant. Yes, and as Jerry said, I'll present. So we have different wheat and legume field trials, and I will focus today on the faba bean and winter wheat field trials, and we have different questions. So this is an overview of our research questions. So the aim of our trials is to optimize nitrogen use in wheat legume intercropping, and we want to know how much nitrogen fertilizer we can cut from wheat legume intercropping without compromising the quality, the milling quality of the wheat, the intercropped wheat. We're also looking at other parameters, for example, looking at as well as reducing nitrogen input, reducing nitrogen outputs, and yeah, so this is our experimental design. So this picture shows our winter wheat and faba bean intercropping, and we have the winter. So this trial we also had in spring wheat and lupin, as well as spring wheat and soybean. And Ali was talking about different ratios, etc. earlier, and so we have a 50-50 ratio, and it's it's a row intercropping, as you can see on the picture. For the nitrogen rates, we have variable nitrogen rates, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we selected this gradient. But one thing you need to know is that it was mostly focusing on the wheat monoculture conventional rate for winter wheat in the winter intercrops, and which is 180 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare. And for spring trials, it was 160. And the fertilizer was applied as ammonium nitrate, and we applied it in 2 doses. And we measured a range of parameters, including yield and grain quality. I'll show you some data from the wheat grain protein later. I won't show you data that I've shown previously on nitrogen losses today. So these are nice pictures of our field trials. And so we have faba bean, soy, and lupin. And this is an aerial picture as well of the field trial, so you can see the design. So as I said, we have the 3 different crops, field trials. We have 3 combinations per trial. So here we have like a faba bean monocrop, a wheat monocrop, and an intercrop of the 2. And
7 o'clock.
And thanks, Deary. And we have 5 different gradients of nitrogen, and each treatment has 3 replicates. So again, I will focus on showing the preliminary results from our winter wheat and faba bean trial, and I just wanted to focus a little bit here about the nitrogen rates. So as I said, we looked at the recommended rate for the monocrop wheat, and for that last year it was 180 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare. So this is 100%. And so what we did was to then have that and create this gradient from 0, 50%, 75%, 100%, and 125% of the recommended rate for the monocrop wheat. For the intercrop, because the intercrop occupied on these plots like half of the land area, we had like a proportionate addition of nitrogen fertilizer in the intercrop plots. And then we also fertilize some of the beans, because there is definitely some of the nitrogen, because they're applied but as granules and not targeted application. There's definitely some nitrogen also being taken up by the intercrop beans. So this was a control for that. Again, thank you, Ali, who explained I called it yield equivalent, but they called it expected yield, which is even better. And so this is how we compared the performance of the monocrop wheat or bean with the intercrop. So here, let's say we have a plot hypothetically of a hectare. Sorry. So the 100% of the wheat here, and then the intercrop would have 50% of the wheat and 50% of the bean. planted, not necessarily harvested. And so the way we compared the performance of the monocrop wheat with the performance of the intercrop wheat was to compare them at kind of similar land area. And so we halved the yield of the monocrop to be able to compare it with the performance of the wheat in the intercrop. So this is something that Ali explained more elegantly than me. So looking at the land equivalent ratio, thank you again to both of the presenters, previous presenters, for introducing this concept. This is the first result I'll present. So here we're looking at the land equivalent ratio of the wheat and bean intercropping. And the x-axis here shows the gradient of nitrogen applied in the monocrop. And as you can see here, again, this dotted red line shows the land equivalent ratio of 1. And so if the intercrops are performing well, they should be above this line. They look like they're above the line, but because we're using these kind of error bars that shows the variability of this dot, of this value, we found that the land equivalent ratio remained stable around 1, not significantly above. It looks like it's above, but it was not statistically significant. And we found that the highest land equivalent ratio was at 0, and the 67.5 kilogram of nitrogen applied. So this is equivalent to 75% of the standard wheat monocrop rate. And then another trend we can see from this data is that the land equivalent ratio is declining with increasing nitrogen rates, though this trend was not statistically significant. So the lack of significance could be due to the fact that we had a small sample size. As I said, we had 3 replicates last year. This year, we have increased that to 4. Again, it's a matter of having enough land to conduct these experiments. And Ali showed earlier similar results, actually, where I think it was wheat and bean, they had very similar looking graphs. Right, so if we focus on now the yield equivalent data, so this graph shows yield equivalent. So we have expressed in ton per half a hectare for the monoculture, which is this point, and then ton per hectare for the intercrop, the triangle. And this is the performance of the intercropping in purple triangles in the wheat, and then in the bean, it's So what we see here overall, I'll zoom in a little bit later, kind of focusing on each panel to talk about the data, specific data, but here I'm looking at overall trends. So what we found statistically is that intercropping did not significantly increase individual crop yield. Increase or decrease in the individual crop yield, regardless of nitrogen fertilizer, even though visually it looks like intercropping performed better at lower nitrogen rate and worse at higher nitrogen rates. These differences between intercrop wheat and monocrop wheat were not statistically significant. Same for the bean. And then we, as expected, nitrogen fertilizer increased the wheat yield, but faba bean did not respond to an increase in nitrogen fertilizer. And here we have the intercropped faba bean. So zooming in a little bit more then, again, this is the similar plot, so yield equivalent by nitrogen fertilizer rate. The difference here is that I also plotted the rate of, here it's the rate of the monocrop wheat, and below is the rate, which is 50%, the rate of the intercrop wheat. And what we found was that intercropping effects on wheat varied with nitrogen levels, as I just explained previously, but these differences were not statistically significant due, again, I think, to this lower replication number. We can see that intercropping increased yield at lower rates. So here, so that's 50% of the recommended rate and at 75% of the recommended rate. The best intercropping performance was at 75% of the standard monocrop rate. This is something Ali also talked about in the talk. So our results do corroborate theirs. And then we also saw diminishing return at higher nitrogen rates, so around the recommended rate for the monocrop wheat and 25% greater than that. So what does that mean? This means that intercropping has the potential to reduce nitrogen fertilizer by 25%, and this also means cost saving without impacting the performance of the wheat, as you can see here. Also, here is the faba bean. I won't focus too much on this. The only thing I want to show is that there was no significant difference between the yield of the faba bean and the intercrop overall. But here at the lowest, so without any nitrogen applied, we can see an intercropping benefit. But again, this was not statistically significant. Something to note was that we had, as mentioned it before, the challenges of applying nitrogen fertilizer and intercropping not necessarily being targeted. Some people do apply it directly around the root area of the cereal, but it was not our case. And so here, something to remember is that the faba bean maintained a yield when intercrop with the wheat, so there was no yield penalty on the faba bean yield in the intercropping. The last graph I want to show here is the wheat protein content. So this graph shows the wheat grain protein in percentage, and then against the nitrogen rates. Again, nitrogen rates for the monoculture above, and then below it's nitrogen rate for the intercrop. As you can expect, nitrogen fertilizer increased protein content in wheat monoculture and in intercrop similarly. And the intercropping effect on wheat protein varied with nitrogen levels. As you can see here, the intercropping increased wheat protein at lower nitrogen rates, and the difference was more statistically significant when no nitrogen was applied at 0. And so here intercropping increased grain wheat protein by 1.41%. And then the other thing we saw as well is that the benefit of this intercropping tended to be smaller with increasing nitrogen rates, similar to the land equivalent ratio, really. And we also here it looks like there's a difference between the intercrop and monocrop grain protein at the highest nitrogen level, but this difference was not statistically significant, and this is something that might look different this year as well because we increased the replication number. So the take-home message then is that based on our 1-year field trial, we found that intercropping maintained individual crop yield when adjusted for land area, so that's the expected yield. And the best intercropping performances were observed at lower nitrogen rates. So we saw that the highest land equivalent ratio was at 0 or 75% of the standard monocrop rate for nitrogen. The highest yield benefit was also at 67.5 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare, which is it's equal to 75% of the standard monocrop rate. And the greatest increase in wheat protein content was on the unfertilized monocrop. And overall intercropping benefits on yield in wheat monocrop, on yield in wheat were more pronounced at reduced nitrogen rate, and they diminished with higher nitrogen rates. I'd like to thank my colleagues and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Imelda. That's really useful and good to see. the outcomes of that. And as you said, that's 1 year's. We got another year's trials this year looking at the same things. So it'll be interesting to see how that reflects and comes across. We've had a couple of questions I think Tom has actually dealt with. And one question from Ruth was, did you actually measure or count nodulation of the beans at different N rates to see whether the bean was actually influencing or the nitrogen was affecting the bean?
No, we didn't, because it's a lot of work actually. But we are thinking about looking at other ways of measuring the performance of nitrogen fixation. So we're planning to look at nitrogen fixation rate, which is another way to look at how the legumes are performing in the intercropping. But based on studies done before, but also on my PhD, that generally speaking in intercropping, the competition between the cereal and legume tends to increase by competing for soil nitrogen. Basically, it kind of is triggering or is stimulating nitrogen fixation rate. So it wouldn't be surprised if we found greater nitrogen fixation rates in intercropping. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question here. What was your plot size for each treatment? They were
they were actually quite small. It's about 15 meter squares. Again, it's a matter of land, and it also explains why it's so important to collaborate with farmers using living labs, because the size of the area are more truthful. So yeah, that's something that was mentioned earlier.
Right, that's fine. I think that's actually, I think was there another question at the top that I didn't go to because I was going to keep it for now. Anyone got any further questions? Add them to the bottom of the chat. We will pick them up and work through. Everybody, both other speakers are still here, so do them on a much wider questions if you wish to. No further questions. Such unusual. There must be some. Oh, we got something. So how are you going to measure your nitrogen fixation rate?
Okay. So I guess there are many ways of measuring it, but one of the ways is to basically looking at so you can take the leaves of the legume and grind it, and then you measure the amount of nitrogen, and then you can use the so the nitrogen from the atmosphere has a different isotope ratio to the nitrogen from the soil, and so you can basically, knowing the information about how much the ratio of nitrogen from the atmosphere and from the soil within that sample, you can calculate how much of the soil nitrogen has been diluted from the atmospheric nitrogen. And so if we see more dilution from the soil nitrogen from the atmosphere, then we can it gives us an idea of how much fixation has happened, because nitrogen fixation uses nitrogen from the atmosphere as opposed to soil nitrogen. But Ali, you've done more work, I guess, than me, and it would be good to hear about how you went about it.
No, I think you've described it accurately. So yes, it's about basically it's an enzymatic process fixing nitrogen, and enzymes prefer lighter isotopes. So you tend to enrich products of enzymatic processes with lighter isotopes, and that means that you can compare the nitrogen isotopic composition in the plant tissue with the isotopic composition in the air and work out roughly what proportion came from the air and what proportion came from the soil. So you can look at the isotopic composition of nitrogen in the soil as well. Personally, I don't do a lot of those analyses, but I do have colleagues who have, and I've been associated in our Diversified project. There was a study that looked at the extent to which intercropping affects the way that plants access nitrogen. And what tends to happen in an intercrop, say barley and pea, is that the two plants, when they're growing together, tend to focus, that they tend to access different sources of nitrogen, or get more of their nitrogen from the source that is not in competition with the other crop components. So barley cereals are generally pretty hungry for mineral nitrogen. They're quite competitive for mineral nitrogen in the soil, and they're good at taking up that nitrogen. So when they're grown with pea will probably take up less of that mineral nitrogen, and barley will take up more. Whereas the pea has this capacity to fix nitrogen, so it will take up more. It will acquire more of its nitrogen from the air, and you can detect that with this by looking at these isotopic ratios.
So that, in a way, because Ruth asked a question, do you think N application is switching nodulation stroke N fixing off? So that's actually sort of argues that case, doesn't it? Is that the plants are self-selecting which route they go down to in the absence of artificial nitrogen.
Yeah.
They'll fix.
Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with all the studies that have been done in this area, but I've not come across a study that's actually measured the nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen derived from air versus the amount of nitrogen derived from mineral N in the soil, and then related that to nodulation. It would be a really useful study to do. I expect you would see increasing nodulation where you've got where the pea plants or legume plants are being forced to, if you like, get more of their nitrogen from the air. But yeah, I think the study remains to be done. So it's an interesting question.
We've kicked off a project that haven't been brought up. We don't know if we've announced it. It's a complete soil fertility with peas and beans, not so much on the intercropping, but at what point does nodulation stop depending on soil residual nitrogen? So we're thinking that could be impacting some fixation as well as biostems. So we'll kick that off here in December. So another one of those, stay tuned, but we should have some answers coming.
Right. Erin, a question for you.
Oh.
Actually, about fava beans. Are they same as fava beans? Yes, they are.
Yes.
It's a phraseology. And the broad beans that they grow in the garden.
Those are not the same.
So broad beans in the garden, they're just different. They're just different varieties of the same species. But also tick beans. Do you know about tick beans?
No, I've never even heard of a tick bean.
Right. Anyone have? So I think tick beans were they look very similar, but they were much smaller ones. It was sort of the beans that were grown before the fava, the sort of the fava bean. So it's another type, like the Carlin pea question from earlier on, Ali, that there's lots of beans and peas and different species and subspecies of all these things. And one of the things that is quite interesting, Haldon does mention in the question, is there is an awful lot of potential for some of these other crops that used to be grown and we no longer are. So we maybe need to look at these, and the word would be heritage, which I know irritates some people to use, the sort of look back to the older species, which we used to grow and now we no longer do. One final question then, and it's all three of you as questions. If your goal is to improve overall soil health, which species would you choose for intercrop? And just as a final finishing off question. Ali, let you go first because you did this to me recently.
Yeah, we did, didn't we? Phrased it slightly differently. Based on the data from our trials, I do like beans, fava beans or broad. Well, I haven't done work with broad beans, but as you say, there's sort of varieties of the same. So our trials where we've looked at the impact on the soil, and we know we haven't done enough to really fully understand it. But fava beans are well known for the fact that they are good at releasing phosphorus from the soil. They exude organic acids that mobilize phosphorus from the soil. So we know that they are good at putting stuff into the soil, and that probably also includes carbon. Can't say we've quantified that, but it would be something that would be good to look at. So probably fava bean, and also all round, I think it's a great thing to include in people's diets. So we should be eating more of these things anyway. So I'm going to go with a fava bean.
Erin.
I was fine with that until she said to eat more beans. Yes, I'm working for the wrong organization, but yeah, I'd say I agree with beans. They are pretty much good on the carbon as well as total biomass that they leave behind. So you got that organic matter too. But I would also say look at your soil texture as a whole, and if it's fairly light, stick with the peas. You don't want to be putting in a bean and then have a disaster at the same time. So for soil health, beans, but at the same time, look at what you can actually feasibly grow.
And Amanda.
Wow, yeah. I kind of based on the field trial we did this year with faba bean, lupin, and soybean, I would say faba bean as well because it performed better, kind of withstanding the weather more than the spring crops. But I also agree with what Erin said about kind of it's all about the relationship between the plant and the soil. And so everyone would probably have a different answer. Um, and yeah, so it's very context specific. And this is again like something about these intercropping relationships that really depend on the environment. And as you know, data from Erin and Ali showed, they perform differently from year to year. So it all depends.
Yeah, excellent. Well done. Right. I'm going to call it a night. Thank you everybody for attending, and really want to thank specifically Ali, Erin, and Imelda for being very happy to do this session for me. It's a great bit of work that we're all doing, and it's really, really positive direction to travel. So it's thank you all for coming as well. Thank you for your presentations. The research is outstanding, and it's really, really good that we're getting some proper scientific research, but it's working with the farmers. So it means that the farmers is almost what the farmers want to know. And that's what's really positive about all of these projects. So thank you all for coming. If you're interested in some talks with either Ali or with us or talking to Erin, please get in touch with us. We're looking for more farmers to do the LEGUMINOSE trials if you're interested. And there's other work going on, particularly in Scotland. There's an IF trial looking at bean varieties, hopefully in Scotland with Erin. And there's other work going on in Scotland with Ali. So please sign up, keep involved, watch out for LEGUMINOSE ES project. Also look up for LEGUMINOSE, and we will keep you informed on everything that's going on. So have a good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we meet you all at some time. Thank you.